First talked about cities like remember those Ukrainian mega sites where they are all coming together in that circular organization, or in early Mesopotamia like Uruk, where they taught you all how to sit in rows, or the Indus civilization, the high citadel and the lower town, but they seem to have material wealth distributed equally. And the basic point has been that these urban agglomerations, when people come together, they seem to start in a very democratic, autonomous way. And when they are eventually, after time, a lot of these places become replaced by these heroic societies, which depend upon male warriors and small-scale aristocracies. So the big argument has been against this idea that as you bring more people together, the more people you have in one place, you're automatically going to have rulers, people who are in control of them. And so that's what they've been arguing against. And we see that in the sense that these other places, these other small societies, is where you have these hierarchies, and they eventually develop apparently in contrast to what was going on in the urban, more democratic places, but basically supersede them. We then, at the last part of chapter 8, talked about the cities in China, which are being discovered, more recent archaeological discoveries, which point to this period of hierarchy and then a social or an urban revolution resulting in more democratic rule. And so this example, we've in some ways dealt with the example that, trying to argue against that scale automatically, the social scale automatically equals social hierarchy. But you would be tempted also to believe from our first 3 examples that maybe these democratic starts inevitably turn into more hierarchical institutions. And what they were trying to say with China is that we have an example here of hierarchy then becoming more democratic. So not only does scale not necessarily have to result in social hierarchy, but it doesn't have to be that democratic institutions automatically give way to hierarchical institutions either. We can see this going in different directions. Now, through this, they've been teasing us with the example of Mesoamerica, which we heard a little bit about before, because whereas a lot of the archaeology has been done in terms of the rise of cities and the rise of the states in Mesopotamia, in the Fertile Crescent, the true large-scale, the largest cities are actually in Mesoamerica and in South America at this time, although the archaeological evidence is a little bit harder to find. Now, when we think about Mesoamerica, what do we usually think about? What's the first thing that comes to our minds as archaeologists? And I say Mesoamerica, pre-Columbus. The Aztec Empire, of course. Yeah, so this is a kind of little map of that somebody made up of pre-Columbus, or I guess I would say what we call Mesoamerica, or at the time of Columbus. So just a few notes. As you can see, some of the what would be the Maya Empire has become a lot of different little places, little Maya, a zone of Maya influence, we might call it instead. So we'll be talking about that in the next chapter. Yes, we usually think about the Aztec Empire, was actually, again, we'll be talking about this in the next chapter as well, an alliance between three royal families. Their capital of Tenochtitlan, which is now the site of Mexico City. Just a couple, here's Tlaxcala, which we'll be talking about in this chapter toward the end of the chapter. And this zone up here is known as Chichimeca, which was more kind of a zone of hunting and gathering, and much more, I guess you might call it traditional hunters and gatherers. Whereas the people in here are starting to do a lot of agriculture, especially around maize. Now, it seems like the Aztecs come from a migration around 1150 in the Common Era, CE or AD, as Graeber and Wengrow like to put it. And so they migrate in, and they were not themselves city builders, but they eventually built a great city, Tenochtitlan, and they were inspired by a place that had been abandoned a long time before they got there, and they didn't know what to make of it, and they called it Teotihuacan. And so a lot of the things that we think we know about Teotihuacan come to us via the Aztecs and their stories, including the name of it. So we don't have anybody who actually, we don't have a script or something that we don't know what they would have called this city. So this comes to us from the Aztecs kind of thinking about this abandoned city and modeling their own city upon it, especially the grid. And I just want to pause for a second and look at how marvelous Teotihuacan would have been when Cortez and the Spaniards arrived. It was a pretty marvelous place in the middle of this lake, and they had all these other great agricultural innovations. Anyway, it was pretty impressive. Can't see that today because it's Mexico City. But if you go to Mexico City, you can then go out and see the archaeological site of Teotihuacan, which is not very far away from Mexico City. Anybody been here? If you get there, you have to fight with all these tourists. I was reading, you can't really climb these monuments anymore. You used to be able to, but they might let you climb them again. It's a very popular, one of the most popular archaeological sites in Mexico to this day. What is that made out of? That's like stone. Yeah, it's all stone. That's why you can climb up it, down, and stand on the top of it. I think that might be, yeah, one of those pyramids. I don't know. The people who have been there say it's great. Wish I'd gone. Anyway, this was a huge city in its day. But when it comes to like what it actually was, Graeber and Wengrow say that the people just kind of shrug and say it's weird because they don't seem to have kings. Now they say it's not, when you usually have kings, they usually show up archaeologically. But here we don't have any monument. I mean, we have these big pyramids. We don't have like royal monuments. We don't have any great tombs where the royals are buried. And we also don't have any of these. What are these things? Yeah, okay. Yeah, there's no ceremonial ball courts. See, you wanted to go out and shoot some hoops there. As we'll find out in the next chapter, apparently it was almost impossible to score in this game, but very deadly. So we don't see evidence of kings among the Teotihuacan in their art. We do have some strange art that shows us some kings in Teotihuacan, but it's, well, Liz, where does it come from? Yeah, the weird part about this, it's kind of it's interesting. It's an interesting story. Actually, I looked up, they get this from a person named David Stewart, who gave a recent lecture called Rulers from the West, Teotihuacan in Maya history and politics. It seems like in the Maya depiction, they depict these Teotihuacan kings coming in and being the kings of them, maybe even. It's very strange. It's hard to say what exactly is going on. And so they puzzle over this for a while, thinking about how sometimes people from afar, people from far away come in and become these rulers of a place. But it doesn't seem like they were actually it doesn't seem like they were able to comment on what was going on in terms of the governance at Teotihuacan itself. This is what was happening over in the Maya lands from far off. And so there seemed to be, or there definitely were connections there, but the Teotihuacan governance is different. So what was happening in Teotihuacan? Graver and Wingro say that this is difficult apparently in any archaeological site. And we saw this back with the Indus civilization sites, that when we see them archaeologically, we see them all at once. We see them all together. And so we get this sense that it had these big pyramids and these big palaces. But as they tell us, actually, the pyramids and then the later residences shouldn't be placed together. First of all, it seems like this started off around year 0, which is always a good time to start, around year 0. I guess that would have been around when we demarcate time by the birth of Jesus. So around year 0, that's when the Teotihuacan starts to take off. And it starts off with they start by building big pyramids and also commemorating them with various human sacrifices, getting a bunch of skulls together. So they're going off in that direction. And they're looking like they're going to turn into, or already are, a very hierarchical society. But then you get this evidence that somebody like burns down the temples or, trashes them. Weren't able to destroy them, fortunately, because there they are today. We can climb on them. But basically, the people stopped building pyramids. So they built these pyramids, they built these big monuments for about 200, 300 years, and then they stop. And they not only stop building pyramids, you don't see any more, all these skulls or people getting sacrificed. That seems to have also stopped. So, Felicia, what do they do instead? What did they do instead of building pyramids and killing people?
I guess that there was we're meeting there for governing decisions.
Yeah, and they especially start to build some stuff. Matt, what do they build?
They build apartments and homes. Not really homes, more like apartment buildings.
Yeah, they go on a big urban renewal building spree. So they build these apartments. They have this pretty crazy social housing project. Luxury apartments for everybody. Well, not really luxury. Kind of like the apartments that Matt grew up in. What was it like, Matt?
I grew up in a couple different apartments. But some better than others. I would say probably the worst one though. Probably describe it
Yeah, so we can probably do better these days, but back in that day, they were pretty nice. We don't see a concentration of power. We see a lot of people have these, and for most people, the majority of people would live in these pretty nice apartment complexes. And as they say, this has probably never been done again in an urban setting. to this day, it's hard to get comfortable living conditions for the majority of people. You usually have some people who have it good. They seem to have people were kins together, or the kinship ties within these complexes, and they lived together. They also had, these apartment complexes would have pretty diverse diets and get goods from afar, which may have eventually contributed to them going downhill. And in terms of governance, we see probably evidence that they had local assemblies, neighborhood councils, similar kinds of governance that we were seeing in places like the Ukrainian megasites, the Indus, and and in Mesopotamia. So a blog post by an archaeologist, Michael Smith, he talks about this as living the good life in Teotihuacan. They had all these apartment complexes that apparently there were as many as 2,000 of them. And here's a kind of a central shrine in one of these. So it's pretty amazing, actually, what they did. Again, they stopped building the monumental stuff and the stuff that we like to climb on, and started building these little residences, or pretty big residences, which were pretty amazing for 1,700 years ago. They also developed a pretty unique artistic style, which Graber and Wengrow say it seemed to be the opposite, or an inversion of the usual Mesoamerican art, where you see these sort of great dynastic or royal figures. In this case, we see pretty much all the people being of equal size and doing weird things like holding on to each other's hands and walking along, and maybe eating some flowers and mushrooms and having funny things come out of their heads. They seem to be, this celebration of people doing things together. So it's pretty wild. They say that some of the art was even veritably psychedelic. So here we see mushrooms being rained down onto people. I don't know. Looks pretty visionary. So again, we have these in terms of the murals and the artistic stuff that we've been able to find from this period. There's really not much evidence of ruling and ruled. It seems to depict this equal social status. So we don't know why they disintegrated and were abandoned. It seems to be that there were, again, these links between people who lived in the city and maybe outsiders. It seems like they eventually went away, but they did pretty well for a few hundred years, which is good. Who knows what we'll be doing in a few hundred years? Don't know if we'll be still here. Well, we won't, huh? Yeah, we'll have to see how we're doing. So what they say is that this led to the kind of the waxing and waning of Mesoamerican cities. Again, revisiting Tenochtitlan as it would have been at the time of the Spanish arrival. So various places here kind of come and go, the Maya, but at the time of the Spanish arrival, we have, of course, the Aztec Empire is really going along. And I wanted to start with, how did these Spaniards who were coming in, sailing in from, well, they had been in the Caribbean and they were sailing in and trying to take over the Aztec Empire, how did they do it? The classic answer to this has been provided to us by Jared Diamond as the idea of guns, germs, and steel, which is that the Spaniards, the Europeans, sometimes inadvertently had the advantage of germs, which they'd gotten from agriculture, steel weapons and the technology of guns, few horses around, and so it wasn't necessarily that the Europeans were smarter or more advanced. They simply had the geographical advantage of having domesticated animals, especially, which led to these other things like the germs and fighting on horseback and stuff like that. And I guess I would say if we learn one thing from this chapter, is that it really wasn't, or it couldn't have been guns, germs, and steel. That what was crucial to the Spanish conquest was that there were indigenous groups that had been conquered or were fighting with the Aztec, who sided with the Spanish, and there would have never, it would have been actually impossible for Cortez to conquer the Aztecs or Pizarro to conquer the Inca had they not had the support of people who hated the Aztecs or hated the Inca. And in the case of Pizarro, he was actually walking into an Inca civil war because there were two people who were claiming the throne. So these kinds of places, the Aztec and the Inca, were very familiar as kingdoms to the Europeans, and they were very vulnerable to a quick military conquest, especially once Cortez got the support of these indigenous allies. So we then turn to the allies that Cortez really needed the most. And as most historians know, although we sometimes tend to forget with the Jared Diamond story of guns, germs, and steel, Cortez would not have been able to conquer the Aztecs without the help of the Tlaxcalans. And this was pretty well known. This was an indigenous city-state. We saw them on the map a little bit ago, who had been fighting off the Aztecs for quite a while. They hadn't been conquered. The Aztecs said that was just because they like to have training ground for their warriors and people to sacrifice, but it seems like they were fairly powerful in their own right. And here is, a depiction of Cortez talking to what has been told to us as the kings of the Tlaxcala, who then assisted him. So they go into this, they go into a little bit the idea of whether there actually were kings in Tlaxcala. And they say that the people who have talked about the Tlaxcala kingdom have simply assumed that it was a kingdom, just because we always assume that when there's a large population, they have to have some sort of king or ruler. Cortez himself, or non-Cortez, says that they were like a republic, like in Venice. And it's kind of a strange thing because Cortez would have been more used to monarchies and kings himself. And so for him to talk about Tlaxcala as being a republic is an interesting observation. They then go into, well, was Cortez right? Were they a republic? And they draw upon an unfinished manuscript by Francisco Cervantes de Salazar, who was commissioned to write what he wanted to write, which is the Chronicle of New Spain. And he got pretty far, but it never actually got published. It's actually difficult to find these days. I don't even know if we can get it in English. But what Cervantes de Salazar discovered from interviewing the people who had been in this situation not too long after the Spanish had landed and overthrown the Aztec, is that they had a pretty developed urban parliament, and they seemed to sometimes vote, but often try to reach consensus in order to have decisions being made. And there was actually a debate or deliberation over whether they should ally with the Spaniards, with some people saying we shouldn't, we should just wipe them out or try to defeat them and not bring them in at all. So on the one hand, we have these written sources from the time saying that the Tlaxcalans were involved in democracy. Graeber and Wengrow say that we also have the archaeological evidence in the sense that there wasn't any place that was a central palace or a temple. There were, like in Teotihuacan, you had pretty good houses, pretty high standard residences or houses. You had things that might be considered places to come together were outside of the city. And so what this all means is that we are probably in what both Cervantes de Salazar and Cortez describe as an urban democracy. So later people who would call this a kingship are probably incorrect. And so, I mean, this is a pretty major episode in world history that Tlaxcala decided to ally with Cortez. And if it was made through democratic decision-making, it makes it a pretty big retelling of some of the our myths about the conquest and who brought democracy to whom. They further talk, or drawing again on Cervantes de Salazar, about how the leaders in Tlaxcala became leaders. You had to go through this period of subordinating yourself and being trained. You had to go through all these trials and moral instructions, and you had to take on the values of the Chichimec. And we saw in the earlier map, the Chichimeca area is that area north of the Aztecs and north of Tlaxcala, which is basically a place of hunter-gatherers. And it's interesting because what they wanted in their leaders were these kind of ascetic and much more hunter-like virtues, you might say. And as I was looking into this, I found in Wikipedia the Chichimeca War. And I want to draw your attention to this a little bit, because what's interesting here is we only hear often about the fall of the Aztec Empire or the fall of the Inca Empire. But that didn't mean that the Spaniards were in control of all of the Americas. So if you look at when they tried to control the Chichimecas to the north, the Chichimeca War actually lasts from 1550 to 1590. It's like a 40-year effort. So they were already in control of the central part of what would become Mexico City. They'd already defeated the Aztecs. They were already there. They already had their horses, guns, germs, and steel on their side. You'd think that it would be easier to defeat these hunter-gatherers up in the north of where they already had been established. But in fact, we have a 40-year conflict. And then if you look at it, the result is a Chichimeca military victory. Basically, the Spaniards gave up. They said, well, we're not going to win this war. So what we're going to do then is go in and send you some missionaries and some stuff and some things to try and buy them off instead of fighting them. And the people they sent up there were some of the Tlaxcalans who had been fighting with them and had already been their allies, and so they sent them up there to try and help out in missionizing instead of trying to conquer. Again, I say this to indicate that we have this image that the Spaniards kind of came in and conquered everybody through their technological superiority, but in fact, a lot of these places took a very long time to bring in, and were never, in fact, completely subsumed. As you read at the end there's the partial preservation of Chichimeca culture, identity, and language. So in fact, the Chichimeca negotiated for how this interaction would proceed. We'll find out more about this in the next chapter when we talk about, again, the fall of the Aztecs and the fall of the Inca, but how in some ways those places were were easy targets in the sense that they had large armies and kings, and once you conquered them, the administrative apparatus fell into place. Other places were much more difficult. At the end of the chapter, they talk to us about the legacy of Teotihuacan. So coming back to the main theme of this place that began as social hierarchy and then ended up being this, looks like a fairly democratically ruled place with urban housing for many people. And they say that the real legacy of Teotihuacan is in Tlaxcala, these places that became and would be important for a time, the rise and fall of urban democracies throughout Mesoamerica. The Aztecs wanted to say that they were inspired by Teotihuacan, but they actually were taking a much different direction. They were inspired by the pyramids, perhaps, and the grid system. But what the Aztecs really created was an empire which looked very familiar to the Europeans because it was very much in line with the kinds of kings and monarchies that they knew about, or what contemporary social scientists call a state. So the Aztecs and the Inca are commonly seen to be part of Mesoamerican and South American state formation. They're recognized as the two places that obviously had states in the Americas.